On a bitter winter morning in January 1991, in the small town of Danby, Vermont, a young woman named Melissa Jean Walbridge vanished without a trace. She was 24 years old, a mother of two small children, known to neighbors as quiet and kind, someone who kept to herself but always had a gentle word when you passed her on the street. Her disappearance on that frozen Thursday would fracture a community, launch an investigation that seemed to lead nowhere, and create a silence that would last for more than 3 decades. The case went cold almost as quickly as the January wind that blew through the Green Mountains that year. But cold cases have a way of thawing when the weight of truth becomes too heavy to carry. What really happened to Melissa Walbridge on that winter morning in 1991? And why did it take 33 years for anyone to speak her name in a courtroom? The vanishing. Danby, Vermont sits in the southwestern corner of the state, nestled in Rutland County, where the Taconic Mountains roll into dense forests of sugar maple and white pine. In 1991, it was a town of fewer than 1,500 souls, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business, where the general store served as the hub of local gossip, and where winters came early and stayed late. The economy relied on logging, small farms, and the few tourists who passed through on their way to the ski resorts further north. It was the sort of community where people didn't lock their doors, where children played outside until the streetlights came on, where you could leave your keys in your truck and find it exactly where you'd parked it the next morning. Melissa Jean Walbridge had lived in Danby most of her life. She was born in July 1966, the middle child in a working-class family that had deep roots in Vermont soil. Those who knew her in high school remembered a girl who was shy but never unfriendly, someone who preferred reading to parties, who could be found helping her mother at home rather than cruising Main Street with the other kids. By the time she was 19, she had married a local man named Christopher Scribner, and by 22, she had given birth to 2 children in quick succession, a boy and a girl. The young family lived in a modest rental house on the outskirts of town, a 2-story clapboard structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch that looked out over a narrow dirt road. The morning of January 10, 1991, began like any other winter Thursday in Danby. The temperature hovered around 15 degrees Fahrenheit. A thin layer of fresh snow had fallen overnight, just enough to dust the bare branches and frozen ground with white powder. Inside the Walbridge-Scribner home, the wood stove in the living room fought against the cold that seeped through single-pane windows. Melissa woke early that morning, as she always did, to tend to her children. Her daughter was 3 years old, her son just 18 months. She dressed them in layers, thick socks and sweaters, the practical armor of a Vermont winter. Christopher Scribner left the house around 7:30 that morning. He worked intermittently in construction and logging, jobs that were seasonal and often unpredictable. Neighbors would later recall seeing his pickup truck pull out of the driveway as the sun was just beginning to light the eastern sky. Melissa was still inside with the children. She had no plans that day beyond the ordinary routines of motherhood, laundry and meals, keeping the fire going, keeping the children warm and fed. At approximately 9:45 that morning, a neighbor named Dorothy Hastings was walking her dog along the dirt road when she noticed Melissa's car still parked in the driveway. The car was a used sedan, rust-colored in more ways than one, the kind of vehicle that barely made it through inspection each year. Dorothy thought nothing of it at the time. She waved toward the house, though she couldn't see anyone in the windows, and continued on her walk. The dog pulled at the leash, eager to investigate the tree line where deer tracks crossed the snow. What happened in the hours that followed remains in many ways a matter of reconstruction, a puzzle assembled from fragments of testimony and the absence of evidence. What is known is this: By early afternoon, Melissa Walbridge was no longer in that house. Her children were there, still in their winter clothes, the wood stove burning low. The door was unlocked. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood, no broken glass. The kitchen table still held a half-empty coffee cup. A basket of unfolded laundry sat on the couch. Everything suggested a woman who had simply stepped away for a moment and planned to return. But Melissa never returned. Clear's throat. It was Christopher Scribner who first reported her missing. He arrived home around 4:30 that afternoon. He would later tell police and found the children alone. His 3-year-old daughter was standing at the window looking out at the darkening sky. His son was asleep on the couch, his thumb in his mouth. Christopher said he called out for Melissa, searched the small house room by room, looked in the basement, walked around the property calling her name into the frozen air. Nothing. He waited, thinking perhaps she had walked to a neighbor's house, though that would have been unusual. Melissa didn't drive often, and the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the road. By 6 o'clock, as full darkness settled over Danby, Christopher called the Rutland County Sheriff's Department. The initial response was measured. Adults go missing for many reasons, most of them benign. Perhaps there had been an argument. Perhaps she needed time alone. Perhaps she had gone to visit a friend or family member without telling anyone. But as the evening wore on and deputies began making calls, knocking on doors, checking with relatives, a different picture emerged. No one had seen Melissa that day. Her parents, who lived 20 miles away in Wallingford, hadn't heard from her. Her sister said Melissa had called 2 days earlier and seemed fine, maybe tired, but nothing unusual. No one could remember the last time Melissa had left her children alone, not even for an hour. By midnight, the Rutland County Sheriff's Department had organized a search. Volunteers gathered at the fire station, men and women in heavy coats and boots, carrying flashlights and thermoses of coffee. They divided into teams and spread out across the frozen landscape, walking the roads, calling Melissa's name into the darkness, shining lights into the woods. The temperature had dropped to single digits. If she was out there, exposed to the elements, time was not on their side. The search continued through the night and into the next day. State police joined the effort, bringing tracking dogs that sniffed at Melissa's clothing, trying to pick up a scent trail. The dogs circled the house, noses to the ground, but found nothing conclusive. They would start toward the woods, then lose the trail. They would head toward the road, then circle back. It was as if Melissa had simply evaporated, leaving no trace of her passage. For those who have ever witnessed a community in crisis, there is a particular quality to the collective fear that sets in. Danby was a town where people looked after one another, where the disappearance of a young mother felt like a wound to the body itself. Volunteers searched abandoned buildings, checked culverts and ditches, walked the edges of Otter Creek where the ice was thin and dangerous. They found nothing. No footprints leading away from the house. No abandoned vehicle. No witnesses who had seen her walking along the road. Melissa Walbridge had vanished as completely as if she had never existed at all. The investigation. The Rutland County Sheriff's Department treated Melissa's disappearance as a missing person case in those first critical days, but within 72 hours, the tone of the investigation began to shift. Detective Lawrence Merrill, a 20-year veteran of the department, was assigned as lead investigator. Merrill was known as a careful, methodical man, someone who worked a case by the book, who believed that evidence didn't lie even when people did. He began by interviewing everyone who knew Melissa, building a timeline of her last known movements, searching for any detail that might explain her disappearance. What emerged from those interviews was a portrait of a woman whose life was smaller and more isolated than most people had realized. Melissa didn't work outside the home. She had few close friends. She spent most of her time caring for her children, keeping house, waiting for her husband to come home. Several people mentioned that she seemed withdrawn in recent months, quieter than usual, but no one could point to anything specific. Those who knew her said she was a good mother, one neighbor told Detective Merrill. She loved those kids. She would never leave them. The investigation focused quickly on Christopher Scribner, as it almost always does when a woman disappears. This was standard procedure, not an accusation, but a recognition of statistical reality. Scribner was cooperative, or at least he appeared to be. He answered questions, submitted to interviews, allowed deputies to search the house and property. He seemed appropriately distraught, though his emotions struck some investigators as oddly contained. He cried at the right moments, one deputy would later recall in his notes, but there was something about it that felt rehearsed. Merrill and his team began to notice inconsistencies in Scribner's account. Small things at first. Scribner said he left the house around 7:30 that morning and drove to a job site in Rutland, about 20 miles away. But when investigators checked with the foreman at the construction site, they learned that Scribner hadn't arrived until almost 11 o'clock, more than 3 hours after he claimed to have left home. When confronted with this discrepancy, Scribner said he had stopped for coffee, driven around, maybe stopped at a store. He couldn't remember exactly. The 3 hours remained unaccounted for. There were other details that didn't fit. The odometer reading on Scribner's truck suggested he had driven significantly more miles than a simple trip to Rutland and back would require. When asked about this, Scribner became vague. He said he might have taken a longer route, maybe driven up toward Killington, just driving to clear his head. He had been worried about money, about work, about everything. His story kept shifting. Small adjustments and clarifications that made it harder to pin down exactly where he had been and when. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about Scribner's behavior in the days after Melissa disappeared. He seemed eager to help with the search, but his participation felt performative, as if he was acting the role of concerned husband rather than being one. He spoke about Melissa in the past tense almost immediately, referring to what she was like, rather than what she is like. When asked if he thought she might still be alive, he said, "I hope so," but the words carried no conviction. Clear's throat. Physical evidence was frustratingly absent. The house yielded nothing that suggested violence or struggle. No blood was found, despite luminol testing of the floors and surfaces. Melissa's coat was still hanging by the door. Her purse was in the bedroom. Her identification, what little money the family had, all of it remained in the house. If she had left voluntarily, she had done so with nothing but the clothes on her back, and even that seemed unlikely given the bitter cold, and the fact that she would never have left her children alone. Detective Merrill expanded the search radius. Teams walked the woods for miles in every direction, looking for any sign of a body, a shallow grave, disturbed earth. They dragged ponds and searched the banks of Otter Creek. They checked abandoned wells and old mining shafts. Vermont's landscape is full of hidden places, ravines and caves and forgotten logging roads where something could be hidden forever. The search went on for weeks, slowly diminishing as hope faded and volunteers returned to their ordinary lives. By March 1991, the active search for Melissa Walbridge had essentially ended. The case remained open, but there was nowhere left to go. Without a body, without witnesses, without any concrete evidence of foul play, the investigation stalled. Detective Merrill continued to work the case as time allowed, re-interviewing witnesses, following up on occasional tips that led nowhere. But in his heart, he believed he knew what had happened. "We know who did this," he told a colleague over coffee one afternoon, his voice low and weary. "We just can't prove it." Christopher Scribner was never arrested. He was never charged with any crime. In the absence of evidence, he remained free, living in the same small town where his wife had disappeared, raising their 2 children alone. Some people in Danby believed he was innocent, a grieving husband who had lost his wife to some unknown tragedy. Others believed he was guilty and whispered as much when they saw him at the general store or the gas station. The case became one of those local mysteries that everyone had an opinion about, but no one could solve. The file on Melissa Jean Walbridge was placed in a box, the box placed on a shelf, and the shelf gathered dust in the evidence room of the Rutland County Sheriff's Department. The case went cold as that January morning when she vanished. The silence. Time has a way of moving forward even when the truth stands still. By the fall of 1992, Christopher Scribner had moved with his 2 children to a small apartment in Rutland, 20 miles from Danby. The move made practical sense, he told anyone who asked. He needed to be closer to work, closer to childcare options, closer to his own family who could help with the kids. But there were those who saw the move as an escape, a way to leave behind the whispers and sideways glances that followed him in Danby. The children were young enough that they would grow up with only fragments of memory about their mother. The boy was barely 2 when she disappeared. His sister was 3, old enough to remember something perhaps, but too young to articulate what had happened or what it meant. They lived with their father in a series of small apartments and rented houses, a childhood marked by instability and silence about the woman who had given them life. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, there is a particular kind of torture in living with that doubt. You watch them across the breakfast table. You study their face when they think no one is looking. You replay conversations in your mind, searching for hidden meanings, listening for the false note that confirms what you fear but cannot prove. The children lived with their father, but they also lived with the ghost of their mother's absence, a presence made more powerful by never being discussed. Scribner remarried in 1995, a woman named Patricia who had her own children from a previous relationship. The blended family struggled from the beginning. Patricia would later tell investigators that Christopher was controlling, that he monitored her movements, that he had a temper that could flare without warning. The marriage lasted less than 3 years. In court papers filed for divorce in 1998, Patricia made no specific allegations about Melissa's disappearance, but she wrote that she feared for her safety and the safety of her children. The divorce was granted. Christopher kept custody of his 2 children. As the years passed, Melissa's daughter began to exhibit signs of psychological distress. She had nightmares, violent and recurring, in which she saw her mother's face. She drew pictures in school that troubled her teachers, dark figures, red crayon used liberally, images that suggested trauma beyond what a child her age should understand. School counselors reached out to Christopher, suggesting therapy for the girl. He declined, saying she was fine, that she just had a vivid imagination, that she needed to move past dwelling on her mother's disappearance. But children remember more than adults give them credit for. Memories form in strange ways, fragments and impressions that don't coalesce into narrative until years later when the mind is ready to process what the heart has known all along. Melissa's daughter, whose name has been kept from public records to protect her privacy, carried something inside her through all those years. A knowing, a weight, something she couldn't articulate but couldn't forget. By the time she was a teenager, the relationship with her father had deteriorated. She was angry, rebellious in the way that traumatized children often are, acting out in school, fighting with authority figures, searching for some way to release the pressure that had been building inside her since she was 3 years old. At 16, she left her father's house and went to live with her maternal grandparents, Melissa's aging parents who had never stopped grieving their daughter's disappearance. It was with her grandparents that she finally began to speak. Clears throat. The revelation came slowly at first, in fragments and whispers, memories that surfaced during therapy sessions that her grandparents insisted she attend. She remembered that morning in January 1991, though she couldn't have been expected to remember anything at such a young age. But she did. She remembered her mother crying. She remembered raised voices. She remembered her father's face, twisted with rage in a way she had seen before and would see again. And she remembered blood, though she couldn't say where or how much or what it meant. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen who specialized in childhood trauma, approached the memories carefully. False memories are a real phenomenon, particularly in cases involving trauma and suggestion. But over the course of months, as the teenager spoke in greater detail, as she drew pictures and wrote in her journal, as she worked through the layers of fear and repression, a consistent narrative emerged. She had been there that morning. She had witnessed something terrible. And for 25 years, the memory had been locked away in the part of her mind that protects children from truths they're too young to survive. In the spring of 2016, when Melissa's daughter was 28 years old, she walked into the Rutland County Sheriff's Department and asked to speak to someone about her mother's case. Detective Lawrence Merrill had long since retired. The investigator who met with her was a younger detective named Amanda Torres, who had joined the department in 2003 and had reviewed the cold case files as part of her training. Torres listened as the young woman spoke for 3 hours, telling her story, sharing her memories, explaining why it had taken so long to come forward. "He killed her," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "My father killed my mother and I watched it happen." The revelation. The reopening of the Melissa Walbridge case was announced on September 15, 2023, more than 32 years after her disappearance. The Rutland County State's Attorney's Office issued a brief statement saying that new information had come to light and that the investigation was being actively pursued. The statement did not name Christopher Scribner, but everyone in Vermont who remembered the case knew exactly what it meant. Detective Amanda Torres headed a task force that included state police investigators and the Vermont State's Attorney's Cold Case Unit. They began by re-examining all the original evidence, interviewing witnesses who were still alive, and building a case based on the testimony of Melissa's daughter. The challenge was immense. 3 decades had passed. Physical evidence had been lost or degraded. Witnesses' memories had faded. The house where Melissa disappeared had been torn down years ago. The landscape itself had changed. But they had something the original investigators didn't have: a witness who was willing to testify. The daughter's account was detailed and consistent. She described waking early that January morning to the sound of her parents arguing. She remembered hiding behind the couch in the living room, watching as the argument escalated. She said her father grabbed her mother by the throat, that her mother fought back, clawing at his hands, gasping for air. She remembered her father's face, purple with rage, and the moment when her mother stopped struggling. She said her father wrapped her mother's body in a blanket and carried it out to his truck. She remembered standing at the window, watching the truck drive away, and understanding even at 3 years old that something irreversible had happened. When her father returned hours later, she said, he told her that her mother had gone away and would never come back. He told her that if she ever told anyone what she had seen, something bad would happen to her and her brother. And so she stayed silent, burying the memory so deep that for years she convinced herself it might not be real. The prosecution faced the challenge of corroborating a memory from a 3-year-old child, now filtered through the mind of an adult who had suffered decades of trauma. They needed more than testimony. They needed evidence. Torres and her team returned to the original investigation, looking for anything that might support the daughter's account. They found it in the details that Detective Merrill had noted all those years ago but couldn't prove. The unaccounted for 3 hours that morning. The extra miles on Scribner's odometer. A review of topographical maps and old logging roads revealed several remote locations within the driving radius suggested by the mileage, places where a body could have been hidden and might never be found. The task force organized new search efforts in these areas, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. They found nothing, but the absence of a body didn't mean the absence of a crime. They also re-interviewed people who had known the couple. Several came forward with information they hadn't shared in 1991, afraid of getting involved, unsure if what they knew mattered. A neighbor remembered seeing Christopher Scribner's truck return to the house around 2 o'clock on the afternoon Melissa disappeared, several hours before he claimed to have come home. Another witness recalled seeing Scribner at a gas station that morning, filling jerry cans with gasoline, which struck her as odd since he had just filled his truck's tank the day before. Most damning was the testimony of Christopher's second wife, Patricia, who agreed to speak to investigators after years of silence. She told them about a conversation she'd had with Christopher late one night in 1996 after he'd been drinking. He said he'd done something terrible, Patricia recalled in her statement. He said he'd lost his temper and couldn't take it back. He didn't say exactly what, but he was crying, saying he was a monster. I asked if he was talking about Melissa. He just looked at me and said, "What do you think?" The arrest came on a cold morning in November 2023. Christopher Scribner, now 62 years old, was taken into custody at his apartment in Rutland without incident. He said nothing as officers read him his rights, placed him in handcuffs, and led him to a waiting patrol car. Neighbors watched from their windows, some in shock, others nodding as if they'd known this day would come. The media coverage was immediate and intense. Local news stations ran stories about the case, digging up old footage from 1991, interviewing people who remembered Melissa and the search that had consumed Danby that winter. National outlets picked up the story. Vermont cold case solved after 32 years, and daughter's testimony leads to father's arrest in 1991 murder. The coverage divided opinion. Some praised the daughter's courage in coming forward. Others questioned whether a memory from age 3 could be reliable, whether the prosecution had enough evidence to convict without a body. The preliminary hearing was held on January 18, 2024. Christopher Scribner, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, stood before the judge and pleaded not guilty to charges of second-degree murder. His public defender argued that the case was based on recovered memories that were unreliable, that there was no physical evidence linking Scribner to any crime, that the prosecution was trying to convict a man based on suspicion and circumstantial details from 3 decades ago. The judge found sufficient probable cause for the case to proceed to trial. In the months that followed, the legal battle intensified. The defense filed motions to exclude the daughter's testimony, arguing that memories from such a young age were inherently unreliable and potentially contaminated by suggestion during therapy. The prosecution countered with expert witnesses who testified about childhood memory, trauma, and the ways in which deeply traumatic events can be encoded in the brain, even in very young children. Clears throat. The trial began on October 7, 2024 in Rutland County Superior Court. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including members of Melissa's family who had waited more than 3 decades for this moment. Christopher Scribner sat at the defense table, his face impassive, his hands folded in front of him. His children, now adults, were both present. His daughter sat on the prosecution's side of the courtroom. His son sat behind his father. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the daughter's testimony. She took the stand on the 3rd day of the trial and spoke for more than 6 hours across 2 days of testimony. She described what she remembered, answered questions about her therapy, explained why she had waited so long to come forward. "I was afraid," she said simply. "I was afraid of him. I was afraid no one would believe me. I was afraid that if I said anything, I would lose my brother, my grandparents, everything I had left." Under cross-examination, the defense attorney pressed her hard. How could she be certain her memories were real and not constructed from things she'd been told or read about the case? How could she remember such specific details from when she was only 3 years old? She held firm. "I know what I saw," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I've lived with this my entire life. I know what happened to my mother." The prosecution also presented the circumstantial evidence. The timeline inconsistencies, the witness statements, the testimony from Patricia about Christopher's late-night confession. They presented expert witnesses who testified about domestic violence patterns, about how abusers isolate their victims, about the likelihood that someone who commits intimate partner violence will lie about it afterward. The defense presented character witnesses who said Christopher had been a good father, that he had raised his children alone after his wife disappeared, that he had never been violent toward anyone. They argued that the prosecution was building a case on speculation and the unreliable memories of a traumatized child. They emphasized repeatedly that there was no body, no crime scene, no physical evidence of murder. Melissa Walbridge disappeared, the defense attorney told the jury in his closing argument. "That is tragic, but disappearing is not the same as being murdered, and suspicion is not the same as proof." The jury deliberated for 4 days. On October 28, 2024, they returned a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Christopher Scribner showed no emotion as the verdict was read. His daughter wept quietly, her grandparents holding her. His son sat motionless, staring at the floor. The judge set a sentencing date for December 2024. At sentencing, Melissa's father, now in his 80s, addressed the court. "My daughter was 24 years old when she was taken from us," he said, his voice breaking. "We have spent 33 years not knowing what happened to her, not knowing where she is, not being able to lay her to rest. This man took her from us, and he took her from her children. I hope he spends the rest of his life thinking about what he did." Christopher Scribner was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He maintains his innocence and has filed an appeal. Melissa Jean Walbridge's body has never been found. Somewhere in the mountains and forests of Vermont, in a place known only to her killer, she remains. Her family holds out hope that someday, someone will find her and bring her home. Closing. The Melissa Walbridge case stands as a testament to the enduring power of truth and the courage it takes to speak it. For 33 years, a small Vermont community lived with the unresolved question of what happened to a young mother on a cold January morning. The answer, when it finally came, emerged not from forensic breakthroughs or new technology, but from the voice of a daughter who refused to let her mother be forgotten. Justice delayed is not justice denied, not when someone finally speaks. Melissa Walbridge deserved better than the silence that followed her death. She deserved to be remembered not as a cold case file or a cautionary tale, but as a person who lived and loved and mattered. Her story, painful as it is, reminds us that the truth has weight, and that weight can only be carried for so long before it must be set down and named. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share this episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard, and your attention to these cases keeps the pressure on investigators, keeps these stories alive, keeps hope burning in the hearts of families who wait for answers. Melissa Walbridge waited 33 years for justice. Others are still waiting. Let's not forget them.